It's red versus blue with Azrael Batman, but did we get the wrong one for a Walmart exclusive? You know me, red is definitively my color, so to see that McFarlane is bringing us a Knightsend version of Azrael, you know, I was definitely going to at least try to make my efforts of acquiring him, because even though I'm not necessarily as well versed with the Knightsend storyline as I am with Knightfall, even though it's part of that overall arc, and I'm much more familiar with the blue variant because we've seen that Knightfall Batman before, Azrael wearing that robotic-ish kind of suit. So now we have a proper Knightsend version where he decides to don red because this Azrael is not ready to quit being Batman just yet, even if Bruce has something to say about it. So it's cool that McFarlane has given us a version of that figure, even though it's technically speaking only half of a new figure. Because as you can see right here, there's definitely some familiarity with a little bit of this bug, specifically if you did manage to acquire the Walmart exclusive gold label Azrael Batman. So much so that I couldn't help but make the comparison myself. Here we have the Azrael Batman from the Walmart gold label exclusive, which is meant to be the much more recognizable version with the blue, the muted gold, and you can see that from the legs up all the way to pretty much the torso area, we're pretty much dealing with the exact same figure that was now painted, only with a slightly much more mute gray, kind of like a much more sickly pale gray, kind of meant to resemble the transformation that the character is actually undertaking in the storyline, along with pretty much identical pouches strapped alongside the waist and left thigh. Otherwise, though, you can see that the little hooks, the little wingtips that he's got on the shins, the boots, the shoulders, even the musculature is pretty much identical. So if you technically do have this guy, you're more or less dealing with the same bug. But here's the thing. This is one of the more respectable things that I do manage to have appreciation for McFarlane, is that they managed to at least change enough that my radar, my needle, so to speak, gets moved in a direction where I'm like, there's enough of a percentage changed here that I think this guy might just be worth picking up even a second time, because you'll notice that once we get to the waist and then up, we're dealing with a whole new beast entirely. Besides the obvious change of blue to then red, you also have a completely different chest plate with shoulder guards, a different sculpt entirely. Of course, this one's meant to be much more faithful to that of the Knightfall storyline that you would expect. When you think Knightfall, you think of that iconic cover of Bane breaking Batman's back, but then you're dealing with this specific Batman that's blue, gold, silver, white, and then you have, of course, that iconic cowl, or rather mask, helmet, whatever you want to call it, with no mouth plate, the red eyes, all completely blue but really well chiseled. There you have it. Over here, however, you're dealing with a much more robotic, Cybertronic-esque looking kind of Batman, because he's meant to be just a little bit more aggressive. So you'll see right here that once you get past the similarities of the bottom torso, pretty much everything that has to do with the legs or even the middle part of the abdomen, you're then dealing with a much more brighter gold to the little yellow pieces that are around the oblique area, the shoulders, and even a little bit around the bicep area. Over here, it's a bit more muted. I don't know if that's supposed to be a little faithful. I do distinctly remember being a bit brighter, not only in some of those panels, but even some other versions from different companies. Like, for example, going back to Mafex, they would be a little bit more on the shinier side. So it does look like McFarlane leaned a little bit more towards a darker color palette with this guy right here for their Walmart exclusive. Whereas when you get to the wider release of this red version, you then get brighter pieces around that shoulder area, and then everything just changes from that point forward. The gauntlets, though, it looks like they're sharing some DNA. You'll notice that the little spikes on the gauntlets are pretty much identical, and it looks like, technically speaking, the hands are identical as well, quote unquote. All they really just did was just take the existing hands that were properly extended and then crunched them into fists and painted them chrome silver. Outside of that, though, it looks like you're dealing with kind of the same sculpting as far as the individual rivets or the individual pieces per finger. But once you move past that, you'll notice that you're pretty much dealing with the same kind of blueprint or layout for those hands. And frankly, it's this notion that kind of leads me into a slight nitpick that I just kind of want to nip in the bud a little bit here, is that if they were able to do that with the hands for this second iteration of Azrael, even if it's from a different arc within the Knightfall storyline, then that means that maybe they could have spared the expense to at least throw in one additional hand accessory, because even though I'm kind of jumping the gun a little bit, both of these Azraels are dealt with a similar problem, in my opinion, even though I feel like this one is more guilty of this problem than this guy, because this guy kind of has a little bit of a secondary excuse that we're about to get to once we move a little higher up in the figure. But neither of these guys really came with any accessories. And you could, make the argument that an awful lot of plastic is already being allocated to making such a gaudy and bombastic and very showy suit such as this really work in the 7-inch scale. But I think even going back to that initial review that I did on the Walmart exclusive, I thought to myself, a secondary pair of hands would have come a long way, besides just the traditional black circular base and the trading card being tossed in. But on the bright side, the thing that was able to kind of quell my problems or my nitpicks with this guy was knowing that he still retailed for the traditional $19.99 at the time. I was able to walk into Walmart. Actually, technically, I didn't walk in. I ordered him online and was able to schedule it for a pickup, but the price remained the same, $20, and it was no problem. I was like, all right, cool, very seamless experience. This guy, not only is he in very high demand because of how scarce he was to really find him by himself, let alone the platinum that is circulating out there. In fact, there's certain regions I feel like it's easier to find the blue platinum than it is to find the red original. I don't know. It's just based on the optics that I've seen from Twitter to the McFarlane subreddit page, where it looks like a lot of people are finding the blue variant a little easier than they are finding this red one. And so if you're going for the default look of this guy, yeah, it would have been nice if maybe some secondary, like this exact pair that this guy's got going on right here, only chrome, so you could swap it out for these fisted hands. Otherwise, he's stuck with this by default. But at least it still makes the character look pretty badass, especially when you take into consideration the little bit of, I don't know what to call it, like these wires or like these straps that are connected from his gauntlets to his back piece that then circulates around to this really, like I said, bombastic and very theatrical red chest plate that has these spikes coming over down here towards the bottom on the shoulders, as opposed to coiling upwards to make him look a little bit more vampiric over here on the Knightfall variant. But moving on from that chest plate and the shoulder guards, along with that very similar looking collar that is now just red instead of blue, things drastically changed. Not only do you have a much more Emperor Zerk-like helmet on him that looks much more sinister looking, but still pretty badass, and it's red with a little red visor. You still got the ears there, and it's still really well sculpted, and it's a huge departure from the much more Batman-esque cowl that he had on the blue Azrael variant. But as you can tell from a little bit of the top heaviness, this time he did away with the cape. He doesn't have the very showy cape that he's got going on over here on the Knightfall Walmart exclusive that is rather difficult to get out of the packaging, because again, those slits are no walk in the park, and getting this guy out of that plastic is kind of a nuisance, and more so over to get him to stand up because of how much top heaviness he is now sporting due to that cape. No, this time he comes with these really elongated spikes, 6 specifically, that are managed to be propped into his shoulder guards. And the assembly is actually pretty intuitive and pretty nice. It actually feels rather snug and tight into the holes right there once you fit the pegs and the little tabs into their proper respective slots. Either one can go. There's no specific order that you have to put all 6 into his shoulders. They're all completely identical, and once you fit them in, this is pretty much how they look. And this is the argument that I was going to make when it came to that whole plastic allocation towards accessories, because even though this guy technically didn't come with any accessories, I thought to myself, yeah, well, he's got a default cape that is technically a little on the wider side, but still, I feel they could have tossed something else in. This guy has a faint argument to make for himself as far as those secondary accessories, because you can almost count these spikes or these cape replacements as their accessories, because they came packaged, like I said, separately, and replacing them, taking them off, and putting them back on, like I said, it's very intuitive, very easy to do, and once you sport them on there, he looks pretty badass. I will admit that. The paneling and the actual sculpting and etching of the pieces themselves is pretty nice, and they're actually kind of sharp towards the tips here, so do be careful. But once you get them in place, like I said, definitely hits the mark as far as delivering on that imagery and that iconography of a Knightsend Azrael. My only little complaint I would say is that I really do wish that the posability found on said spikes here on his shoulders would have been somewhat articulated, because technically speaking, they cannot move. Because due to that tab that fits into the slot along with the peg, they're pretty much stuck in this position right here. They're pretty stagnant, so you're not going to be able to make them kind of flip or to the side or kind of angle them in a way to make him look like he's maybe gliding in the air or any kind of articulation whatsoever. So that's a bit of a bummer, because I feel like that's an awful lot of potential left on the table to make him look even more terrorizing and badass. And that probably would have quelled a little bit of the little bit of nitpicking that I was doing with the accessories, because then this could have been, I guess, more or less classified as an accessory, because you could have articulated it. It could have benefited the figure, would have made the price point much more worth it, because I believe this guy does go for the $22.99 in certain markets. So he's a little more inflated than this exclusive. Even though this guy's technically not exclusive, he's still pretty difficult to find as of the recording of this video, and I feel like articulating these guys would have gone a long way. But just because the wings are not articulated doesn't mean that the rest of the figure isn't. And it's pretty identical to that of the original Knightfall Batman. So I'm gonna breeze through this somewhat. The head is able to rotate 360 degrees as well as tilt up and downwards, even though it could have been a little better nudging towards the bottom because of the way that the collar is sculpted out. Once you're able to get kind of like the bottom chin part out of the way because of how wide and how high the collar piece really is due to the design of this Azrael, then he's able to tilt up no problem and even a little bit side to side. So that's a pretty generous head joint that is found there. And then the ball joints on the shoulders are pretty much similar to that of the original, so not much is really lost there. Is able to lift upwards and backwards. Of course, it kind of has to stop due to the way that these guards on the shoulders are sculpted, but extension towards the sides is pretty good, as well as the bicep rotation, even though you're technically not able to rotate 360 due to the way that the gauntlets are unfortunately connected towards the back. Every time that any kind of like piping or any sort of like straps are molded or sculpted into the figure, very similar to that of like Hazmat Batman that had the pipes coming out of the mask and then into the back, you're going to be losing a little bit of articulation there. It kind of comes with the territory, so you're going to have to deal with that. But here's the thing, the way that these straps are sculpted and then twisted around, they were at least kind of, they thought ahead of how this figure is going to have to be articulated, so they coil it in a way that doesn't feel too invasive, if that makes any kind of sense. Because even though bicep rotation can happen 360, it can still go a good way towards this side right here and almost the full 180. I almost want to say, not the 360. What's between 180 and 360? The 220. There we go. Or the 240. No, 240. I'm sorry, 240. There. I'm failing at math today, but the two joints at the elbows are also able to bend all the way up until the point where the gauntlet gets kind of in the way, and that's a similar problem to that of the Knightfall version as well. And the wrists can nevertheless rotate in place 360, although again the gauntlet is a little overly sculpted around that area because of this piece right here, so a little bit of rotation is lost, but the inclination and the moving inwards and outwards can still be found there. It's just, like I said, a little difficult to nudge because of the cuff around the gauntlet itself, but technically it is still there. Torso still works and activates the same way that it did over on the Knightfall version, where you have kind of like this mid-torso cut right underneath the chest plate, so you can technically nudge it side to side. Just do be careful with, like I said, not only the backpack piece because of how much more elongated it is versus the Knightfall version, but also this piece where the chest symbol, the bat symbol here in the front, is sculpted. Because of this point down here at the bottom, it could come into conflict with a little bit of the pouches that are found right there around the waist. Your ultimate solution to that would have to be to simply extend the back, because there's proper extension found on that mid-torso cut as well. All you have to really do is just kind of extend it towards the back and then twist, and you're able to get a little bit more motion found right there before it eventually conflicts with the rest of the chest plate right there. So you can still find a little bit there. And then waist joints or the waist cut can also be nudging a little bit side to side, but it doesn't look like it can really fully rotate due to the way that everything is just sculpted there. But there is some decent torso mobility found in both of those joints right about right there. Top joints at the legs can fully extend the leg forwards about that far, and then slightly towards the back before the gyat gets in the way, because he does have a gyat on both figures. Wait, does it? Yes, it does. Knightsend Azrael still got the cheeks. Stellar Blade out there giving us cheeks in gaming. Oh yeah, it's a good time to be alive. And the legs can still extend towards the sides almost at the full 180. Joints at the knees can still fully bend. Just do be careful with those wing pieces because it does look like trying to get them to bend all the way up does come into conflict with this piece and could either break something or it could just simply pop it off its shoulder. So do be careful there. And thankfully, they are able to bring back that ankle flush joint that I really like. So you're able to pivot the foot downwards and upwards pretty generously, slightly pivot it inwards and outwards, and even get it to rotate it at 2 points. Although I noticed that as I try to do so, I come into a little bit of conflict with those wingtips on the shins that even with the Azrael Batman, I thought was just a little exaggerated, a little overkill in my opinion. But of course, that's just more so on the design of the Azrael suit and much more of a complaint towards that rather than the figure itself. And the toesies can still be found there that are actually able to bend almost all the way up on this guy. That's actually pretty surprising. So that's definitely going to be able to give you some decent footing, especially when you take into consideration just how top heavy some of these wing pieces can really be for this guy. So it's looking like what they kept the same is pretty much what was really working pretty well on the Knightfall variant, which has to be the majority of the articulation, the bottom part of the legs because of how well sculpted they are, despite, like I said, the overkillness of the suit, but that's mainly because of design choices. And then when it came to actually changing the things that had to make sense for a Knightsend variant, they changed enough that it really is a pretty respectable pickup. One that I'm actually pretty proud of picking up because I was like, all right, even though I got the Walmart exclusive gold label Knightfall, the wings, the way that the helmet is sculpted, the way that the chest piece along with the straps that are connected to the gauntlets, it kind of gives it this shelf presence, this value that makes me go, yeah, this is actually feeling just different enough to almost be classified as a different character. But it still manages to pose a very debatable question, a question that I do feel has to give birth to a bit of a dialogue, which has to be, do you think that maybe there should have been a role reversal here where maybe the Knightsend variant should have been the Walmart exclusive and then the Knightfall Batman Azrael should have been a wider release? Because I do think it's a little unfair that right now the only real way to get this guy would probably have to be the aftermarket, whereas this is a wide release, and then of course it's got its own fair share of platinums out there with the blue variant that is kind of sharing some DNA with this guy because of the blue. And I know that this shade of blue might not float every single collector's boat. I know that there's some others out there that probably prefer the darker shade of blue that Mafex took with their version, and then Mattel, some of the older ones from back in the day, probably had a darker, much more navy blue saturated look to this character. So it kind of makes me think, if they were so quick and so easy to go back to this buck and practically replicate it here, and again going back to the little things that I was bringing up with the hands, then what's stopping McFarlane from probably issuing some kind of 2.0 of this guy, of a proper Knightfall, to maybe give folks that didn't have a chance proper back in the day, especially with COVID being in full effect and all that stuff? It's like, maybe this guy is overdue much more for a wide release versus this guy. So if you already got this guy, this is still actually a pretty worthwhile pickup because of how much was changed. But I still feel like some opportunities could have been expanded upon to really make people who missed out on the original Knightfall Batman make like this guy much more worth it. But there's still some badassery and some coolness happening with this guy that it never really felt like a compromise to me. And it was able to bring me to a 8 out of 10 rating for the Knightsend variant of Azrael. One that does make the whole wave that this guy got released in it worth it. And hell, if maybe I do come across the blue variant, might pick that one up as well, considering that the blue does have a saturated tone that feels much more different than this guy and might make the whole ensemble package look cool up on the shelf, should that come to pass. Alright, it's time to divide the chat. Who do you prefer? Knightfall Blue Azrael Batman? Knightsend Red Azrael Batman? Blue versus red. You take the blue pill, you take the red pill. I'm actually now kind of surprised this guy was not a Target exclusive, considering this is the Walmart exclusive. And he's got that Walmart blue going for him. Let me know down below. I'm looking forward to seeing what the fighting is going to be all about. I'm kidding. Not really. Kind of. Sort of. But in either case, if you enjoyed this video, hit the thumbs up button. If not, hit the thumbs down. And as always, stay humble. I'll see you guys later.